Welcome to Effective Change, a podcast sharing the journeys of people who have created social impacts. At Effective Change, we question the meaning of effective social impact and find out how these leaders have found their own ways to run a socially impactful organization.
I'm Consuela, and this is
Natalie,
and we're hosting today's episode. We hope you're doing well today. In today's episode, we will be speaking to Sam, who is the founder and CEO of Third Eye Intelligence. Third Eye is the beginning of next generation health tech technology powered by self-designing AI, which is dynamic, adaptive, and functions 24/7. Their early warning system for organ failures makes early intervention easier for doctors. It enables target treatment and ultimately increases survival rate in ICUs. Sam, we're so thrilled to be having you on this podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
First, we'll just start with some quick fire questions so we can get to know Sam better. So, Sam, would you be able to describe yourself in 3 words?
Yeah, okay. So I would say computers, artificial intelligence, which is technically 2 words now, except the category is 1. And lastly, I would say Metallica, because that's the kind of music I'm interested in.
That's perfect. Thank you. Do you think that social impact is measurable?
Depends what the category of impact is, but yes, you can have metrics to define it.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll go kind of deeper into that later on in the podcast. Could you let us know who inspired you or who is still inspiring you now and why?
For Third Eye, initially it started off because of my own family member being in the ICU, and their passing is what raised too many questions to why ICUs are so inefficient. And that's what helped me realize after doing more work experiences with other ICU clinicians is that the problem isn't that they don't have interventions to give in the ICU, it's that they don't know when to administer them. So really it's a workflow optimization issue, is that if you're able to somehow flag an alarm to enable them to intervene early, that some of these lives can actually be saved. And that's what brought on to creating the product, the early warning system. So it was a very natural progression from the initial stage of what happened by experience to my loved one. But then over time, it just kept becoming a yearning to chase after creation of this product and delivery, really, which is what keeps me going now. Is I've started on this path, I need to see the end to it, no matter what that is.
I think that's a perfect attitude when things gets hard. Thank you for the perfect intro. Now we'll just go into a bit about your business part. Would you be able to tell us again in your own words that what Third Eye is doing in 3 to 5 sentences?
So Third Eye really is an AI software company, not necessarily a healthcare company. The problem we've chosen is to tackle in healthcare. And what we've created in particular is an early warning system for organ failure, so that we can predict organ failure before it actually happens and give clinicians an alarm so that they can intervene before it's too late.
So is there any other stories that's behind the founding of Third Eye? Not just the one that you told us. Is there anything else that helped you along the way while you were founding it? Any other stories, that behind the scenes story that you want to share with us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so before the solution became the solution it is, it wasn't incepted from the very beginning. Before, it was actually going in a totally different route. So for example, when that event happened, what happened afterwards is I did a little bit of work experience to understand what's the actual problem in the ICU, because I didn't want to fall into the same issue of creating something and then realizing customers don't want it, which happened as well, by the way. So this happened in India at the time. And then I just spoke to the doctor and I said, look, can I do some work experience to understand why is it that you couldn't tell what happened despite recording these patients 24/7? And what I realized there, the problem is basically scale, right? The amount of population of doctors versus the patients in the hospital is just not on the equilibrium. So they just can't handle the numbers that they're pitted up against. In the UK, it was a totally different scenario. Here it was that we just don't have the resources. We don't have enough beds, which was only aggravated more by the pandemic, right? When the nation was on its knees, we were denying care to other patients so that we can reroute care in the ICU to patients with COVID, right? So each nation, what I realized, each country in some extent has a problem in the ICU, and it all comes down to management. So that's the problem that was defined that I wanted to tackle. And initially, the algorithm I created did not tackle that problem. So when I actually spoke to a clinician, they theoretically slapped me in the face and said, we're not going to use this, dude. What the hell? So that's when I was like, okay, now I need a clinician on the team, because otherwise I'll just keep designing things that looks cool to me, but doesn't necessarily address the key issue here. And that's how organically my team grew, right? I got a clinician on board who also said the same thing. So she looked at my app and said, it's terrible, and it was. So we were like, okay, let's redesign the algorithm to actually tackle the problem at hand. And then when we actually redesigned it, we then did a few more pitches, raised some small amount of funds to convert it into a prototype, enough to a point that we could go to certain CIOs and clinical information officers in hospitals to get partners on board. And now, after the several iterations and such, we have 3 NHS trusts that have signed on to do a trial with our algorithm, and we will be kicking off our fundraising come Feb, literally in the next few weeks, to try and raise some funds to actually inject capital for running this trial.
That's super cool. I was wondering, I just heard you say that you did quite a few pitches before you actually be able to get more funds. Because I'm always personally quite skeptical about like these kind of startup competitions, especially at unis. I know Imperial have quite a few, and I watched quite a few at Edinburgh, and I was like, are these competitions actually helpful? Like, except for the money that obviously you will win, do you think you learn something or you can gain stuff through these kind of pitching competitions for people who are interested maybe in the future starting their own business?
So it depends what your standing is already in the entrepreneurial world, right? So for me, I never had the idea that I wanted to go down this path. I was more than happy sticking in my research and having a nice software engineering job and being fine with that. The typical Indian pathway for me anyway, because that's where my original race is from. But for me, what changed is that I needed an in into this world, if that makes sense, a doorway that allowed me to practice how do I articulate this complex idea in a way that other people that my audience is going to listen to understands it, but also gets excited by it, right? And you don't get any of this training during your PhD, or if you're doing anything deep tech, this sort of mentality and understanding, you're just not taught. The only way you can do it is to experience it. So for me, these competitions were actually very valuable, and because towards leading up to the actual pitch event, they had a series of these basically training scenarios where they essentially taught you how to pitch, how to create a business plan, and how to actually build a business in general. And that's what also enabled me to understand, okay, I need to speak more to my customers. Hence, I need the relevant team members to grow. Otherwise, this will remain an idea. And it organically grew from there. So for me, coming from a non-business or non-managerial standpoint, this was a huge evolution for me to become who I am right now.
That's super interesting. I never kind of thought about that way. I was also interested, when like, we're not going to pep talk, but it's more like in the process, obviously there will be failures and there will be setbacks and be like, oh my God, this is getting hard and I've not designed something that's actually what they need. And what would you tell yourself when something like that happens? So you're like, do you just go straight out, let's do it again? Or you might also feel a bit like, I worked so hard for this and now this is not exactly working out the way I want it to be. Like, what would motivate you again to keep going and make sure you get better next time?
So I think in my case, to some extent, it was a lot easier because I was already motivated because of death of a family member, right? So to me, it was more of a personal connection that either way, I am going to make it happen. Because initially, when I had created certain design iterations, I actually reached out to companies that were already in the field, technically who are my competitor. And I first told them, look, I've designed this. I found some shortcomings in your algorithms. Perhaps this will improve your product. And they just dismayed me. Right? They just couldn't care less. And that's what started the fact that, okay, if I won't do it, no one else will do it, right? So for me, my motivation was very clear from day one, what I wanted to do. So in that case, it was rather easy just to take that feedback. Initially, I was very defensive with clinicians. Personally, I was like, oh, you guys are dumb. You don't get it. This is important. This will change your lives. It will make things easier. But at the end of the day, you kind of just have to realize your product is worthless if no one uses it, right? And ergo, your business will also not be that valuable if no one uses what you've created. So technically, regardless, you still have to somehow either create your product in a way that will literally change their opinion, which is something Apple does really well. Right. I'm very impressed with the fact, how when they got rid of the headphone jack, the 3mm one, and everyone was upset, but now it's just such a norm thing because now everyone's moved to wireless earphones or no one's complained about it. They brought that change essentially, right? So if you think about it, if you're able to change someone's opinion to that scale, great, you will become a very successful CEO and have a very successful company. If not, then you sort of have to, in a way, just bite the bullet and understand what the customers need, because technically that's what will grow you to the next stage. So it was essentially that kind of feeling that if I don't do this, then it will never happen because I can't necessarily change their opinion. Clinicians are some of the most stubborn people in the world. I know for a fact, no matter how great I create my thing, I won't be able to change their opinion, which means I need to somehow change my product standing so it makes sense to them. and it's the only way this thing survives. So that was essentially that motivation. Like, if I don't do this, it just won't happen.
That's really interesting. I was reading quite a few books about how you could differentiate your business from other people. And is that what you were saying about how Apple kind of able to differentiate itself and change the behaviors of its customer instead of just being led by the customer? I was wondering, do you have any tips on, like, say if someone is starting their own product and obviously they're doing some research into their customers, but how do they actually get to know the central problems of, and also how to differentiate their product from their competitors? Because obviously now there's so many variations.
Yeah, so what I would say is the reality is it's not necessary the customer knows what they want, right? So for example, if I went into a customer and I said, what do you actually need? They'll say, I just want another WhatsApp, right? But the problem is the current state of the alarms that they have are terrible. So giving them just something that is the same thing, just looking more pretty, doesn't actually solve the problem. It's still the same issue. And it's the same thing what the classic line is, right? If they ask Henry Ford, what do they want? They would say faster horse, but then the car came about, right? It's the same issue, right? The customer doesn't necessarily know what they want, but to create something that the customer would want in the end is where your innovation as a company comes in, that you have innovated, created something that didn't exist. But now you essentially are trying to define the step one part, which is what is it that you should create? And that is, how do you solve that pain point? And the only way you would know is basically understanding what their day-to-day interaction is with whatever they're doing. So the way I went about this is I literally did a work shadow experience. I just said, I just want to stick with an ICU clinician like a fly, and I want to see everything that they do from start to finish, right? And I did that with 6 different ICU clinicians in 2 different nations to figure out what is it that they do every day. And that's when I figured out, because they don't even know what their problem is right now, because they're so tuned to what they're doing. It's so normal to them that they've just accepted the fact that their life sucks, that the way we work in ICU is trash, and that's how it's going to be this way. So asking them what their pain points are, they will never give you a straight answer. The only way you can figure it out is by literally understanding and experiencing their world, which is different to yours. And that's when you realize, that's when I also realized is, holy crap, like half of this can just be changed, right? If they just do this simple thing, the rest of the way they work changes completely. And that's when you have that light bulb moment. It's like, okay, this is what I need to attack, because this would change their other processes and it will make them so much more efficient. And then that's how you define your business case around it as well, right? So the only way you would understand is by experiencing the other side of the world, or your customer's world at least.
That sounds so amazing. I wish you could find something like, I was like, oh, this is something we need to change right now. I'll start a business around it. And I feel like that's literally the beauty of innovation. I always feel like I'm looking for it, but I can never find it, because I feel like that's because I still don't have a focus. But like, enough about my thoughts. We're also wondering about, what's the next stage for you guys? Now, obviously, you're like raising funds and going to next stage, but what are you like? Bigger plans maybe in 5 or 10 years for your company?
Overall, one of the things is our largest market is going to be the US. So somehow we're going to have to define a strategy to migrate also to the US and not just remain in UK or Europe. As in, we should have 2 channels of growth, right? One for UK and Europe and one for US, given that is one of the largest markets we should be attacking as well. The other is that our product itself is, so our AI isn't something that is just frozen in situ. It's essentially AI designing AI, right? So we don't fundamentally hand design our AI algorithms. We actually have an AI algorithm that creates them on the fly. So one of the things that I'm excited with is, how do we create an infrastructure that when deployed in, let's say, 10 different hospitals, they still teach my designer AI from these 10 different experiences. How do I design this baller one new AI model that works flawlessly across all 10 of them in a decentralized way? And there's a technological element to that needs to be researched and experienced and developed. So that is something that we're very excited towards, and how we're going to actually pull that off from a product standpoint.
What have you learned along the way so far, and what you feel like the things you've learned you really want to share with our listeners that might help them in their business ventures?
I think one of the key things is, how do I communicate my idea and my work in a more efficient manner? If we were having this call about a year ago, every answer would have been a 40-minute paragraph to try and decipher the real answer. The biggest thing that I've learned is how to communicate more efficiently and get it to the point, because in reality, when you talk to VCs or even people in general, they don't have time, right? So being able to sell your story and be definitive about what you want not only engenders that confidence in the other person, like, okay, this person knows what they're talking about, but at the same time, it's like, okay, they're very clear about their plan, and that clarity is power. And this goes also when you're running a team, talking to interns or talking to your team members, being clear about what you want from them and when you want it by is absolute power, because then you can easily control and basically validate whether what is being done is right or not. Because whenever there's ambiguity in what is being done, it's always a problem.
Thank you, Sam, for sharing your thoughts and journey on third eye intelligence. So moving on. So from our quickfire questions, you did mention that social impact is measurable. Part of the podcast explores on the definition of making effective social impact. So in your opinion, how do you define effective social impact?
Good question. Yeah. So I can only answer from the experience or the remit of my company, and particularly the industry that I'm in. So, for example, if we look at how NHS runs in general, whenever technology is acquired, you have to give metrics on what is your health impact, right? Which could be translated to social impact on that front, because healthier individuals is healthier for general public, is also healthier for economy, etc. And one of the ways we define impact is by measuring, or what we will be doing during our trial, in the upcoming trial, is going to be defining what is called QALYs, which is basically a measure for quality of life. And in particular, we look at that for patients after the ICU. So for example, if the patient was in the ICU, but they were treated whatsoever, given A, B, C kind of treatment, but their quality of life after the ICU is no better than what it was or what it should be, then fundamentally that treatment actually didn't provide the value that you want. And the same thing can be translated essentially to our case, is if our technology doesn't improve that quality of life after they've gone through the hospital phase, then we technically haven't achieved what we want to achieve as a company. We're not providing that value. And that value, similarly, in the healthcare field, is translated to also economic value, because the more quality of life the patients have that you're offering, the better your economic value as well as a company. So yeah, in our case, it's actually quite hard metrics that we use.
I'm very intrigued as to how you've used quality of life as the metrics, because in my opinion, quality of life is very hard to measure. I think that's something that I've questioned as an individual of what quality of life means. But what I love about your way of interacting with your metric is how you've got the two-sided aspect. So you've got the patient's perspective, so whether you're actually adding value to their lives, and also from a data perspective for your actual product and services, which can be very beneficial when you're pitching to more investors, that you have these results, you can prove to them that everything that you've been building works and has an impact. So in your opinion, what do you think are the common misconceptions about running a social enterprise, or generally about social impact?
I think sometimes, and this could be my own inexperience, let's say, in the field, is a lot of times kind of seen that if you're doing one, then it doesn't necessarily mean, like, for example, in our case, this is something that I say a lot to my team as well, is like, being able to save lives or having a positive impact doesn't mean that you sacrifice profitability. You can have a successful business financially and economically while still having a positive impact. It's more so about how you design your business model around it. So if your business model accounts for the fact that you want that positive impact, or you're saying your business is based on achieving certain metrics that you define on how you choose to have positive impact, then technically you should be having a profitable business whilst having that positive impact. I think it requires a lot more business model innovation, and as opposed to a technological innovation, because even simple technologies can lead to a huge positive impact depending upon how your business model functions. So one of the big misconceptions, I think, is that a lot of people do not value the business model innovation in this field as much as they value technological invention. I feel like you don't need the most baller piece of AI or technology to get things done. I think even a simple technology introduction, but with the right type of business model, can actually have a huge societal impact.
An interesting thing that you mentioned was the different types of innovation. So a lot of us in this world currently focuses on technology innovation. You mentioned there's business innovation, but there are also other innovation like customer experience innovation that people do not know about. So as the leader What do you think the sort of social impacts that you guys are driving towards in the future? Where is third eye intelligence heading?
I mean, in our case, the future is a bit difficult to tell because as a founder, and more importantly, right now, as a CEO who's trying to close the deal to move forward, I also have to be somewhat, to some extent, some narrow visioned as well, as in what my next milestones are and how we're going to achieve them. And the beauty of Third Eye is the entire business model is based around saving lives. If we don't have that impact in that society, or even in the demographic of those patients going to the ICU, then fundamentally our business isn't of value because we're not doing anything that they would want to pay for. Our entire promise is based on we're having that impact to the society. So in a way, the fact that we're tackling this problem, it's sort of already interweaved and etched into our business, including our model. So for example, though we charge, our business model is based on software as a service to ICUs, but it's also based and valued on the amount of lives this would potentially save. So software as a service can go through multiple different value propositions, right? We can say software is worth £5 a month or £10 a month, or I could even say it's worth £10,000 a month. But that number comes from how many lives we could actually save in the healthcare industry. So in our case, it's already actually part of our mission to save those lives and have that impact to society. So I think over time, that mission will still stay the same, which is how do we impact and save the most amount of lives that are going through. But the idea is that we won't just stop in the ICU. We kind of want to go outside of the ICU as well. ICU is just the beginning for us, and it's a beachhead for us. But the idea is to sequentially go from ICU to the ward, from the ward to maybe general care, and then primary care, and hopefully even mobile devices. So the idea is how do we go sequentially outside, beginning with a beachhead.
Thank you for sharing that, Sam. I love how you describe the sequential goals that you guys have. So, the way I see it in a metaphoric way is that rather than being an onion and peeling going inside, you're starting from the core of that onion and adding layers so you can amplify the effect that third eye intelligence is making. I really love that. And I guess for the audience out there that are potentially looking to start a software company, what are your advice?
So with Third Eye, so the entire premise is, despite we're a software company, we would always only tackle healthcare. We don't aim to digress away from healthcare. Our vision is to become the medical software AI company. And for anyone starting a software company, what I would say in the first instance is to try and figure out what your software will actually do. Just try and figure out what is a problem you're trying to solve, right? Your solution can change over time. Like, I'm not married to the algorithm that I've created. I'm hoping, in fact, in sometime in the future, as soon as we start hiring, an engineer can destroy what I have completely and create something new out of it. Because I'm never content with what we have now. And the reality is AI moves so fast that things can become obsolete in a matter of months. And the same thing with many software companies. When Uber came about, in comes Bolt and God knows how many different variants. So what I would say is try and figure out the exact problem your software is trying to solve and a strategy on how you would build your software so that you can continuously iterate. But the cool thing about software companies is that the capital required to actually create it in the first instance is quite low, as opposed to something like a hardware company. And it's very easy to pick up the relevant skills as well. My biggest advice would probably be just get started. Even if it's wrong, just get started. Even if you make a mistake and you're going down the wrong path, just get started. Either way, you'll find your path eventually. But if you never start, it will never happen. Just get started. That's what I would say.
I completely agree with you, Sam, here. I love this why not spirit that you're emphasizing. You know, the fact that everyone should just give things a go and get started, because you simply never know what will happen and what can happen. So for our listeners out there, if you're passionate about something, get started. So Sam, in your opinion, what are the small ways that people can create social impact, particularly for those that aren't looking to start a whole business like yourself?
Okay, one question though. What would you define as a social impact here?
Great questions. So based on my own amateur knowledge, I believe that social impact itself is based on driving change in the four pillars of sustainability, and that is human, economic, social, and environmental. And it's trying to drive ways to implement change in a societal level. But for me, effective social impact is finding ways to actually scale it. So let me give you an example. So I'm in my house. and I live with 4 other people. But if I'm the only one that are recycling, but all the other people aren't, then it sort of diminishes the effects of what we are doing as a household. So the idea that each of us should, for example, encourage the people around us, family, friends, our local community, and find ways to strategize on how we can upscale things. That is what effective change is trying to do, is through these conversations with different people to try to understand the definition of what it means by making effective social impact, because there are so many different ways we can do it. But also, how can we upscale it? How can we ensure that this message is amplified to a larger audience?
So, I mean, if we think about it, the majority cases when you want to achieve social impact, what you're actually trying to do is somehow bring a lifestyle or work style change in order to actually bring the impact to a reasonable magnitude. So I think a lot of it just involves how do we change the current lifestyle or bring about a change in opinion and how we do things. So it's the same thing that Third Eye is trying to do with the ICU, with the clinicians, for example. We're trying to change their work style to be something more efficient using our product. And usually the most difficult things that companies have to tackle is how do we bring about that change in opinion? Because that's something hard to do, which is why companies put so much money into making their products look cool, making themselves look cool, etc. So I guess the easiest way to do without doing a business is to you decide yourself how you want to change your lifestyle to have that better positive societal impact. And this could range from multiple things depending upon what you want to achieve. But if you can change your own opinion to be more positive, then that would be the biggest change that you would bring.
Thank you so much, Sam, for coming on the podcast. It was great having you. I think what Consuela and I found the most inspiring was the backstory you had with starting Third Eye Intelligence and how you went from a non-business background to where you are now as the CEO, and how you've iterated that process of actually understanding what the problem is, actually observing, being with a clinician day in, day out to find out that underlying problems that they don't know, to the iterative process and in redesigning your software, your algorithm, so that it actually adds value to help these patients. But yes, we wish you the best of luck with Third Eye Intelligence, and thank you very much once again for coming on the Effective Change podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Awesome. Yeah.
You can now find us on Anchor and Spotify. If you like our discussion, please follow and share. Don't forget to follow Effective Change on LinkedIn and Instagram for exclusive updates, inspirations, and memes.